And the final technical intervention we were interested in exploring, the notion of linking feedback to assessment criteria using the feedback wizard. However, at the time of the study, the feedback wizard was only in limited use across the Sheffield Hallam University, and therefore few students involved in this study had experience of receiving feedback generated by the tool, although a large number had received feedback where the feedback was linked to the assessment criteria. Participants were shown examples of feedback documents generated by the feedback wizard, and coupled with their experience of receiving other forms of feedback grids, they were able to articulate the potential benefits of this approach. Students felt that they could understand feedback better when it was aligned to the original assessment criteria. Students could easily identify their strengths and weaknesses against specific areas in a structured way that could lead to the development of action plans. On each feedback document, the feedback wizard provides an indicative weighted grade for every assessment criterion. Participants in the study perceived this approach to provide transparency in how tutors calculate the final grade for their work. And finally, interesting points were raised about how feedback should be presented. Students acknowledged that aligning feedback to assessment criteria and presenting this in a grid form summarised the comments clearly and cohesively. However, there was a competing preference for feedback to be positioned against a specific point in their original work, so they are able to easily identify the context of the feedback.
Stuart, do you mind if I come in here again and just ask a couple of questions? Because I think this is really interesting to talk about the actual purpose of feedback as well. And so I just wondered whether you would like to make any comments from all the work you've done on talking with students about how they use feedback, as to whether students view the feedback as more a justification for the grade that they received, or as actually having an impact on the future learning or the future tasks that they will be asked to do.
Thank you, Jeff. This is something we didn't go into a great amount of detail during the interviews. Many students did see the grade as a means to justify the feedback or vice versa. But many students did when explicitly told that feedback is designed to feed forward into future assessments and they should be reflecting on it and action planning it, that they did kind of understand why it was important. And it's interesting to point out that we had 4 different groups of students within this particular study from across the university. And one group of students in particular, the radiography students, because their professional course and professional body requirements, in the course it's been built about the importance of reflection and action planning, that they understood why it was important to use feedback in future assessments, whereas the others hadn't really been told why it was important. So we kind of understand that there's something around explaining things to students rather than just expecting them to understand.
Yeah, and I suppose that's always going to be the hard thing for lecturers. Often many things are implicit, and there's an implicit understanding of why something is important or why something is relevant, or even where the feedback can be used in future tasks. But for many students, that line is not an obvious one. And so I just wonder again, how do we set up systems that actually make it easier for students to see the line between the actual comments that are made and the next activity that they're going to be asked to do?
That's certainly an interesting point, and I'm hoping that my next few slides might cover what you've just been asking.
I'll be quiet and let you keep going. Thanks, Stuart.
Thanks, Jeff. My next few slides that I'm going to present are based on the findings of the research project, And what we've tried to do is to put some suggestions or recommendations forward if you were considering putting into practice some of the technical interventions that we discussed earlier in the webinar. The first slide, therefore, in our putting into practice set of slides, discusses suggestions for putting into practice online publication of feedback and grades. We feel that it's important, first of all, to find out what tools and techniques and technical support are available at your institution to enable you to publish feedback and grades online. And once you've identified what tools are available, you need to start to think about who needs access to this information. Obviously you, your students, but what about the rest of the teaching team and your administrative staff? You also need to ensure that it will be easy for both staff and students to access and archive online feedback and grades for future reference. You need to think about whether you're publishing provisional grades or waiting until after grades are ratified. Whatever the status of the grades are, ensure that students are informed of this so that they understand whether the grades are an indication of where they are in the learning process or are their actual final grade for that piece of work. Ensure students can access feedback for the duration of their study, or at least ensure you tell students how long feedback will be available to them. Students add a sense of permanence that where things were published online, it will always be there for them. However, we understand that in many instances, feedback might only be available while the students are completing that particular module. So it's important that students understand how long this information will be available to them. But it's also important to set and communicate to students the date when you expect to publish feedback and grades. And it's important to keep students informed of any delays so there's no anxiety where they expect something on a particular date and it's not actually there. And we also feel it's important that whenever you change the format or delivery method of feedback, it's important to inform students in advance of how to access and make use of this format of feedback. So there's no, students aren't seeing feedback in a format that they're not expecting. And it's also important to suggest techniques that enable students to effectively and easily download, store, and retrieve online feedback. When putting into practice the adaptive release of grades, again, find out what technology and support is available at your institution to enable you to introduce adaptive release of grades into your practice. When doing so, it's important to articulate to students the purpose and process and educational benefits of feedback for learning when introducing adaptive release of grades. And it's also important to set these clear expectations at the beginning of the assessment process. Provide clear guidance to students regarding the process of reflection in the context of assessment, action planning and feeding forward into future assessments. And it's important to note that adaptive release changes the boundaries of the assessment process. And in order for students to fully engage with this approach, the importance of reflecting on the feedback must be identified as a key step in the process from the start. Assessment strategies that provide opportunities for feed forward to future assessments can also enhance the approach of adaptive release of grades in order for students to get the most benefit from it.